Thank you for coming in this pretty cold day. You all get extra credit for coming today. I hope the food is good. I'm Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Today we are focusing on the Persian Gulf part of our work here on campus. With a great pleasure that we have with us Dr. Dina Esfandiary, who's a senior advisor in the Middle East and North Africa Department of the International Crisis Team. Previously, she was a fellow in the Middle East Department of Century Foundation and International Security Program Research Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and an adjunct fellow in the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program. Prior to this, she has a long list of engagements, so I'm just selecting a few of them. Prior to this, she worked at the Center for Science and Security Studies in the War Studies Department at King's College in London and in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Dr. Esfandiary has published widely, including in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, International Affairs and National Interests, Arms Control Today, and Washington Quarterly. She also has co-authored an important book about which hopefully we'll talk more because the book is about triple axis, Iran's relations with Russia and China, and Living on the Edge, Iran and the Practice of Nuclear Hedging. She holds a PhD in War Studies from Department in the War Studies Department at King's College in London, and master's degrees in King's College London and Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. She comes to us directly from Switzerland, and I wanted to blame this cold weather on her, but she said that actually Switzerland was much more pleasant than the weather we have here today. So on that, please help me to welcome Dr. Esfandiary.
So should I switch on this one or use that one?
No, switch that one because
switch
that
this
goes
one.
to the, yes.
Okay,
That
hello?
goes to the...
Got it, okay. Thank you so much for that. I hate sitting through introductions. They always make me squirm. So thanks for making me squirm for the last 5 minutes. That was really pleasant. So now that you've established my credentials as an Iran person, I'm going to talk to you about everything but Iran, because my talk today is more on the rise of the smaller Gulf Arab states. Obviously, Iran and its impact on Iran and the rest of the Persian Gulf is a part of it. But yeah, my last book was about how the smaller Gulf Arab states have become forces to be reckoned with in the region. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. So the premise of my book is that these smaller states in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf Arab states, they've become more assertive in the pursuit of their interests over the course of the last several years. And this assertiveness has been spearheaded in particular by the UAE. The context for that is that the UAE is basically a small power that's sandwiched between two major powers in this kind of sub-region, two regional giants, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so countries like the UAE, but you could say the same also for Qatar, for example, they've established this policy of balancing and trying to balance between the two, Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also contain the threat, or the threat that they perceive, particularly from Iran, but also to a certain extent from Saudi Arabia. Historically, when the UAE was first formed in the 70s, it was bogged down in institution building for the first 10 years of its life. And it was busy building a state, essentially. And so it very much deferred to Saudi Arabia when it came to setting its foreign policy priorities in the region, which is why at the beginning and for several years, decades in fact, you saw the smaller Gulf Arab states basically lie behind Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh would set the tone and they would just follow suit. As you well know, the UAE is a wealthy state. It's got a pretty small population, which means its rentier bargain is particularly strong. All of this kind of is important to as a context to explain where we are today. And its foreign policy goals generally have been pretty consistent throughout Mohammed bin Zayed's tenure, basically. They've wanted to boost the country economically and politically. They've wanted to develop lasting relations with friendly powers. And they wanted to do that all the while containing Iran and Islamism in particular. So this is really particular to the UAE. As a result of this growing assertiveness, you've seen in the region more centers of decision-making in what was previously a pretty bipolar Persian Gulf region. So what does this mean? It means that the regional context is generally more unpredictable. These small countries are more willing to pursue their interests, even when those interests don't coincide with those of their friends, allies, or their bigger security guarantors, which is the newer aspect. And this means that there's more scope for tension and conflict, simply because there's just more flashpoints. It's essentially more of a free-for-all in the region. And some of those tensions, some of those conflicts, what we've witnessed over the course of the last few years is that they've become increasingly public. So it's not to say that tensions didn't previously exist, particularly, forget Iran for a second, but within the Gulf Arab states, tensions have existed since the beginning of I was going to say time for them, their time, since the beginning of the 70s. But these tensions were previously managed behind closed doors. They were never out in the open. And these brotherly states would basically resolve their tensions behind closed doors. And essentially for the rest of us, it looked like nothing had happened. Now it's incredibly public, as you saw with, in particular with the 2017 split, and also amongst the, even between Saudi Arabia and the UAE that are, two of the closest countries in this lot, even amongst them, their tensions are much more public in recent years. So rewind a little bit. What's assertiveness? Why are we talking about assertiveness? It's basically increasingly bold foreign policy decisions made by a country. So this, by the way, is the definition that it's not like I made it, but basically drawing on literature, this was what I decided to focus on. Increasingly bold foreign policy decisions made by a country and a demonstrable willingness to involve itself more forcefully in various international arenas in the pursuit of its own interests, even when this does not coincide with the interests of, again, friendly states and allies. And as part of that, you also have a component that's devoted to developing self-sufficiency. So an assertive state is not just more forceful in its foreign policy, but it wants to become increasingly self-sufficient. It doesn't want to have to rely on other countries. I then established basically what would essentially look like evidence of this assertiveness, different categories of evidence. The first, in my view, is capabilities. And these can be political, diplomatic. In the UAE's case, evidenced in, again, a greater diplomatic presence internationally, a serious PR campaign in order to rehabilitate or to fix its image. It can be military capabilities. So again, in the UAE's case, there's been a serious increase in the purchase of military capabilities. There's been also diversification and a serious pursuit of self-sufficiency in establishing its own military-industrial complex. And all of this is driven by, ironically, a desire to build closer relations with the US. So they want to be self-sufficient, but they want to do it by building closer relations with the US. And also driven by some of the demands of the new active conflicts that it was a part of. But capabilities can also mean economic, cultural, so things like using aid and money in the pursuit of their own goals, something that we actually associate more traditionally with the Gulf Arab states. But the dispersing of this aid has become more targeted. It's no longer just, we're going to hand out cash to countries that are in need. It really is, we're going to give this money only if we can get a change of behavior in return. We saw that in Egypt, for example. But it also means economic diversification internally, but also internationally. All of this helps the UAE build its capabilities. So capabilities is one aspect of this assertiveness. The second one is the intention to use these capabilities in the pursuit of their own goals. So there is no point in having the capabilities if you then are like, well, we're not going to use them, which arguably is kind of what they had already in the 90s, where they were already building up their military arsenal, but not really with an intention to actually use it. I look more in depth at the way that they did this in Yemen, the way they did this in Libya, and how they did this, in the pursuit of their own interests. And then the third aspect is a little less obvious. For me, you don't really have longevity and assertiveness if the state in question doesn't view their policy as successful. So the success of the use of these capabilities as viewed by the state is the third dimension. Now, we might say, okay, well, it hasn't been successful in arenas like, I don't know, actually Yemen, Libya, these are good examples. But as long as Emirati officials, and if you're looking at other small Gulf Arab states, their officials, believe that they have been successful, that this policy is working, then they're going to continue to use it. So this really helps ensure that this policy is not just like, oh, we're going to dabble with it, and actually it doesn't work, we're going to stop. It just ensures that this is a new trend that they're firmly embarked on. So in the UAE's case, it really does think that its policy of assertiveness is working. When you talk to Emirati officials, experts, academics, they'll tell you our image has improved significantly, though they will admit that their association with Saudi Arabia at the time of Khashoggi's murder, their image took a bit of a hit. But then the path of normalization helped them improve that image once again. So, they think that it really is working. They have greater soft power. They are perceived by their partners, including by the US, as a critical partner in the region. Also a partner that they can actually work with, not just a reliable partner. And this is really important for Emiratis. They've had a lot of success in diversifying their partnerships. They've built relationships with countries around the world, big and small. And they've actually managed to balance those relationships. If you think about the context of the Ukraine conflict, the Emiratis working quite closely with the Russians. Initially, again, their image took a little bit of a hit when they didn't just fall in line behind the US in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. That was kind of short-lived. Now they're back to a good place, as it were, because they've kind of managed to find that balance a lot better. On the diplomatic track, they think they've been successful. They've normalized with Israel. They've normalized with Turkey. They've rehabilitated Assad. All of this are, from the Emirati perspective, examples of success. They find it easier to conduct economic deals in Europe and in the US. And this is a big thing for them. And it's one of the reasons why they really woke up to this idea and to the importance of their image when they had this crisis. I think it was back in 2006 with DP World, which was one of the port authorities that they have in the UAE, and they were trying to make a deal with an entity in the US, and basically Congress was up in arms, and this really surprised Emiratis. I think there were various congressmen and senators that came out and associated them with the 9/11 attacks, called them terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this really took Emirati officials back. And so this was when they really realized the value of investing in improving their image. And so today, making deals abroad, internationally in the Western world, for them has become much easier. And so this is a clear sign of success. They're nimble, relatively nimble when it comes to foreign policy changes. Again, for them, that's a real success. They have greater sway over regional policymaking. They're considered a mediator in various conflicts. And they think, so this is the one where I think it's a little bit more debatable, but they think even militarily, they've been very successful in the arenas that they've gotten involved with, including in Yemen. So while most of us would view the 2016 Emirati pulling out of Yemen as a sign of actually, well, this clearly failed, it didn't work, they see it very differently. They say, we pulled out because we achieved our objectives. Yeah, the Houthis are still there, but that wasn't our objective. Our objective was to secure southern Yemen in the areas that are of concern to us, and to ensure that you don't have the rise of al-Qaeda in Yemen. And arguably, they succeeded in that. So it didn't make sense to have as many resources invested in Yemen at the time. And of course, now they have durable, sustainable relationships that they've built with partners on the ground. And this is where they're kind of trying to copy Iran's relationship with its proxies. And so for them, it made sense to leave. And it made sense to have the current configuration that they have in Yemen. So for them, assertiveness is working. And that's why I think it is likely to last. So why did they, and others, but especially the Emiratis, embark on this new policy of assertiveness? One of the things that I do in my book, and I will admit that it might be a shortcoming of it, because I think it's important to admit it, is that I focus exclusively on the foreign policy context, on the international context. I don't look as closely as at the domestic reason behind this kind of assertive foreign policy push. And the reason for that is actually very simple. It's because I wanted to be able to continue to do research in a country that, like other countries in the Middle East, it's a complicated country to navigate. And there's a very clear red line when it comes to doing research on their foreign policy and research on their domestic politics. And so I didn't want to cross that red line. So I focus solely on the international context in which this assertiveness was developed. And for me, there are three main motivators behind this policy change. The first is the Arab Spring. The second is the US statement of a pivot to Asia as basically the beginning of US disengagement from the region. And the third is the nuclear deal with Iran. So the Arab Spring, the 2011 Arab Spring, essentially created a void in the region. And it gave countries inside and outside the region the opportunity to fill that void. It also highlighted the Iranian threat because of Tehran's reaction to the Arab Spring and their kind of new deployment of a hard power in the Middle East. It was clearly also willing to fill that void, and so the Iranian threat really became even more significant to the Gulf Arab states. It also kind of spearheaded the beginning of this perceived U.S. disinterest in the Middle East and in ensuring the survival of the Arab regimes that were falling apart, basically. And so it started to put this really uncomfortable feeling in the minds of Gulf Arab leaders about how the U.S. would potentially no longer be a reliable ally. And along with all of that, the Arab Spring was a real threat to their own domestic political systems. This impacted their sense of regime security, which naturally impacts the way they make foreign policy. So the immediate result was an initial regrouping of the Gulf Arab states, which is kind of counterintuitive. They actually came together. And the states that were richer helped bail out the states that were struggling, and they worked together a little bit at the beginning. But over time, familiar tensions and disagreements actually reemerged, and once again, they were competing amongst themselves. So that was the Arab Spring. Then you had the Obama statement of a pivot to Asia, which was in 2012. Despite the fact that this statement really didn't have, at least at the beginning, much of an effect on the ground, it didn't matter. The Gulf Arab leadership basically saw it as a statement of intention, saw it as a statement of the US's long-term goals for the region, and they essentially freaked out. It basically proved to them that the US was going to be unreliable, that they wouldn't deliver on security guarantees to the Gulf Arab states when required. And so you had a real state of panic amongst the Gulf Arab states. The Emiratis, initially, their reaction, kind of like how the initial regrouping was a little bit counterintuitive, the Emiratis' initial reaction was, okay, they're leaving the region, but maybe it's just an Obama thing. And so you saw them start to build ties with the Republicans, thinking, okay, well, if it's a Trump administration, then they're definitely going to stick around. They'll be reliable. They'll help. And, obviously they were sorely disappointed. And the other thing that they did, which is a little bit more of a rational reaction, was that they started, again, embarking on this diversification of their partners. So they start to engage more with the Chinese, the Russians, some of the other European states. And arguably in this, they've actually been quite successful. On the nuclear deal with Iran, I think the obvious first effect that the nuclear deal had was that it really highlighted the Iranian threat further. The Gulf Arab states saw the deal as basically freeing Iran, and as a result, Iran would pursue its regional ambitions, and they would be able to do this with all the funding that they now had access to. They thought the nuclear deal legitimized Iranian leadership, particularly in the eyes of the West, which is something that was new to them that they didn't really like, because it meant that suddenly Iran was a prospective partner to the US, which obviously, they were jumping light years ahead of where we were, but this is how they viewed it. And it also contributed to a further loss in confidence in the US, because they saw the US not just as now unreliable, not willing to help out the Gulf Arab states, but pivoting towards their enemy, pivoting towards Iran. What's more, they started to view US actions in the region, including, for example, Obama's unwillingness to hold up its threat against Assad for the red line on chemical weapons. They started to view that as, well, America is going to appease Iran in order to ensure that this deal is implemented properly. So not only is it not reliable, not only is it pivoting towards Iran, but my God, it's appeasing our worst enemy. So for them, it really was like basically the last straw. It really reiterated that it was absolutely imperative that they secure themselves, that they pursue self-sufficiency in a more active manner, even if this meant actually building more relationships with other countries in the short term in order to become self-sufficient in the long term. But really, this was like the final nail in the coffin. And today, you see others. This policy of assertiveness really was spearheaded by the Emiratis, like I said. But today, you kind of see most of the smaller Gulf Arab states. In fact, not just the smaller ones, even the Saudis are actively being more assertive. Now, for the smaller Gulf Arab states, it's noticeable because not only are they more assertive vis-a-vis the US, but even with each other. For the Saudis, it's particularly striking to see how assertive they are and how willing they are to do what the US, or not do what the US wants them to do. I think that's the new aspect of that relationship. For a country like Qatar, they actually dabbled with assertiveness in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, and that cost them the first crisis with the Gulf Arab states, where they pulled their ambassadors. I think it was in 2014. And for them, Qatari officials realized that they had perhaps gone a step too far. They weren't quite ready for this. And so you saw a very interesting, we're going to try this out. If it doesn't work, we'll pull back, which is exactly what they did. And then obviously with the 2017 split, it kind of forced them to be a little bit more independent and assertive. And so that became, for them, it became more of an entrenched policy after the 2017 split. So what does this policy of assertiveness mean for the region, other than what I explained before, where there's more risk of tension, there's more decision-making centers in the region, all of which creates a measure of unpredictability. For the UAE, with success comes greater scrutiny. So there's literally much more international scrutiny on their human rights records, on their work in the region, on the methods they use in the pursuit of this assertiveness. This is something that they're not necessarily used to. They've managed to kind of get around doing what they want relatively quietly behind the scenes in the past, whereas now everything is much more in the open. There's greater scrutiny on their economic achievements. And this has actually resulted in greater tensions with Saudi Arabia. It was a couple years ago where Riyadh basically decided that they'd had enough with Dubai being the big economic power center of the Persian Gulf. And so MBS started to make rules for companies that wanted to set up their headquarters in Dubai. And they basically said, if you want to deal with the Saudi market, which of course is much, much bigger, then you have to base your headquarters in Riyadh. So you saw the beginning of this economic competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And this ended up eroding some of its the UAE's financial and economic leadership, of course. You saw Abu Dhabi become the target of attacks in 2022. So, the more successful you are, the more eyes on you, and the more you end up becoming a target, which is exactly what happened. This eroded its image of being a bit of a safe haven and safe and happy place to live in a region that's frankly quite, for lack of a better way of putting it, unstable in the Middle East. Weapons sales to the UAE came under greater scrutiny, in particular here. Arguably less so in Europe, but still, more people were talking about it. It wasn't just a simple slam dunk, okay, we want this, this, and this. Now the Emiratis had to make a case for what they wanted to buy. And it also impacted how they were perceived by other Gulf Arab states, making their relationship with their brothers more complicated. So countries like Oman, for example, started to view the Emiratis as a complicated, potentially threatening country. I spoke with one Omani when I was doing my research for this, and it was quite striking that they were like, they're waiting. This was before Sultan Haytham became sultan, and they were saying, they're waiting for the death of our sultan because basically they want to invade and take over half of the country. And so you really had these historical fears of the Emiratis that were resurfacing again. The other problem with success is the more successful you are, the more others want to mimic your success. And so you had greater competition, like I said, with the Saudis, with the Qataris. And this really started to chip away at the lead that the Emiratis had established with this foreign policy. In some countries, Libya, for example, their steadfast support of one side over the other hampered their ability to be an effective mediator, which is what the Emiratis were trying to position themselves as. And again, you had mediation competition, and you have that very openly right now, amongst the Gulf Arab states, where they were not the only mediators anymore. They're now competing with Qatar in places like Afghanistan, in Israel-Palestine. They're competing with the Saudis in the Horn. So it wasn't just a space that was exclusively reserved for them. Some policies that the Emiratis have pursued really have left them kind of between a rock and a hard place. I think normalization is a great example of that. They established this policy of normalization with the Israelis, which put them in the good graces with the U.S. They spearheaded this, and that again made them look good. It made them look like a rational actor in the region, certainly for Westerners. But domestically, a lot of Emiratis weren't very happy with it. They didn't want it. So what they ended up doing was obviously cracking down and ensuring that nobody could debate this issue, could talk about this issue. They seem to have a relatively good lid on it, but every time conflict breaks out between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it really puts them in an uncomfortable position and makes it increasingly difficult for them to maintain this policy of normalization, which even now, even with what's going on now, they've come out and openly said, we will maintain normalization with Israel. It also makes it, every time conflict breaks out, and with the latest round even more so, it makes it more and more obvious that they can't use normalization as leverage to improve the plight of the Palestinians, which was initially how they sold it internally and internationally. So it makes them look weak, makes them look stupid, and that's not a good look. But arguably, other policies, like I said before, have worked. And their policy on Iran is actually, I think, a decent example of that. They learned the hard way that engagement with Tehran was basically going to be the only way that they could de-escalate. Initially, they depended on the US to contain Iran. And even under Trump, they really pushed the Trump administration to leave the nuclear deal. They pushed the Trump administration to kind of contain Iran once Iran started lashing out in the region. They saw that, the Trump administration was not really willing to do that. And suddenly the UAE found itself in the line of fire. And this really scared them. It really did. So this was a clear instance where they decided, okay, the US can't be relied upon. We have to secure ourselves. We're in the line of fire when it comes to Iran. We don't have the means to contain Iran militarily, so we're going to try engagement. And on this, I think it's worked. We saw the most obvious example of it working, I think, was with the attacks against Abu Dhabi in 2022. There was a flurry of diplomatic activity between the Emiratis and the Iranians in the immediate aftermath to ensure that it wouldn't escalate into all-out war between them. And it worked. The Emiratis weren't happy about it, but they talked, as did the Iranians, and they were able to de-escalate, and we didn't see, something that could have frankly spiraled out of control. So basically, I'll stop there. This is that's my thesis is basically that, this is a trend that is now firmly established in the region. I think it's clear that it's not going to go anywhere. It has worked in some respects for Emirati officials and for the Emirati kind of foreign policy objectives, but it also has created serious difficulties that I think Emiratis are going to have to grapple with, and greater competition, greater potential for tension, and flashpoints in the region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dina. This is such a wonderful presentation. A whole lot to digest.
Yeah.
So we open the floor for your questions.
Thank you, Dina, for this wonderful presentation. My question is about sort of how these Gulf Arab states have recalibrated how they understand the relationship with Washington, and in terms of particularly how they've invested so much money into think tanks, into PR firms, to essentially reframe themselves as the U.S.'s closest ally in the region, but then have to sort of weather these storms where they don't see eye to eye. So could you talk a little bit more about how much investment they put into changing the political landscape in Washington in their favor?
Huge amounts of investments, financial investments, human capital investments. The best example is an Emirati ambassador in DC. I don't know whether you know him, but I mean, he's like a fixture now in DC. He's been here for like a decade. It doesn't matter how many scandals he's right at the heart of, and Emiratis are so confident that he's doing a good job that they don't pull him out. He's still there. And he still has really good relations with everybody in DC. So clearly, Emiratis are right to be confident about it. And obviously, truckloads of cash invested in improving their image in the PR firms, as you said, in academia and think tanks. It's weird because, I mean, you described it pretty well, right? They've invested all of this. And yet today, that investment isn't really paying off in the way that they want. So again, if you're looking at it from the outside, that doesn't look like a success. To me, that looks like a sunk cost. Like you spent all this money, all this political and human capital, and frankly, you're not getting much bang for your buck given the direction U.S. president in the Middle East is going in. But again, they don't see it that way. They really don't. They see, again, the ambassador in DC as somebody who's succeeded, who has built very good relationship. He was at the heart of like the Trump administration, basically, and did not hesitate to go in and pull shots and have meetings with Trump and his administration on things like Iran. So for them, that's like, we have a direct line into policymaking in the U.S. I think they've obviously lost some of that under the Biden administration. And I think with each successive U.S. administration, it's going to chip away at it some more. But from their perspective, it's still worth doing. So that's on the official level. On a non-official level, I think they think they've been quite successful. And arguably they have. I mean, a lot of academic institutions and think tanks are perfectly happy to take money, by the way, ours included. I mean, perfectly open. They will take Emirati money, and in some instances, this impacts what the think tank can say. I like to think it doesn't, given that I'm here saying why I say it's for us. But that I think is a measure of success, and our talking points are being communicated quite well here. I think despite everything that's happened, I still think a lot of people in the Western world, in the US and in Europe, really do see them as the one partner that you can have, one rational, normal, most Western-leaning partner that you can have in the Middle East region. I don't think there's anybody else that they can turn to like they can to Emiratis. So again, Qatar is posing a bit of a threat to that. Even the Saudis actually have invested quite heavily in DC, but they haven't been as successful because I think their investment was money at the very beginning, and there's only, I was going to say there's only so much money you can throw at all of them, but that's probably wrong. But given what they were doing, let's say the money they were throwing, the problem was not enough to resolve the situation. And we really saw, since the show that even before, within the US Congress and Senate, like much greater questioning of the relationship with the Saudis. And I think in the last year and a half, maybe two, I think in Riyadh this has become really obvious. I was doing interviews in Riyadh in the immediate aftermath of the oil OPEC decisions in, I think it was last autumn, and it was literally like that. We were talking to people in Mocha and various Saudi officials. The day after that decision had been made, and the Saudis had gotten a lot of pushback from the US. Also a lot of shock in DC, because DC had invested a lot of time and effort into convincing the Saudis to tone down pricing and stuff. And they were super loud. They were super angry about the blowback, the pushback they had gotten from DC. They were like, listen, we're doing what's best internationally for oil, for the price of oil, for all of us oil-producing countries. This isn't about making life easier for America. This is about ensuring that you have a constant flow of oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I found it really interesting how they were willing to be very openly against what the US was asking them to do. And I think that's just the new reality in these countries' relationships with DC. It's no longer, Washington picks up the phone to Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh and says, this is what I want you to do, and they follow suit. I think it's a little bit more of a relationship of equals where Washington has to kind of make peace with the idea that, yes, these guys are still going to be some of their most reliable partners in the Middle East, but that doesn't mean they're just going to do what DC wants them to do, that they're kind of entitled to pursue their own objectives and their own policies.
Thank you so much, Dina, for this talk. My question, it might be a little bit too much in the domestic realm, and therefore, if it crosses the red line, please let me know. I was wondering, you spoke specifically about economic self-sufficiency, but what specific policies, because I can't really see how they would even approach this. Are we talking about import substitution policies, like the way, I can't see that happening the same way Japan and Korea in the 60s, 70s. I don't see them having the resources, correct me if I'm wrong. The population size is very low. They rely on migrant workers. but I can't see that type of policy of exporting goods, manufacturing goods, exporting goods, and not importing as much in order to become economically self-sufficient. So it seems mostly it's in the realm of military. But the military, they're mostly purchasing it because, again, they still don't have the means, industrial means to produce their own goods and machineries. And they're largely an entrepot. They're essentially a region that's used as a site of trade transactions and exchange. So how can it be, how can they even perceive of themselves as being economically self-sufficient?
So, to be fair, I don't think they perceive themselves as being economically self-sufficient. Exactly. They perceive themselves as being on the path towards self-sufficiency. That's really how they see it. I agree with you. The prospects of self-sufficiency aren't exactly great. But there are certain things they've done and they've had to do that has improved their standing economically. So I'll give you a bit of a stupid anecdotal example. The Qataris, as a result of the split, they were suddenly isolated. They couldn't get food imports as much, except for countries like Iran and Turkey that kind of rushed in and helped them out a little bit. And so they were forced into finding ways to ensure food security for themselves. And in the course of 3, 4, 5 years, they built one of the biggest regional dairy production facilities. They airlifted cows into Qatar during the split because they didn't have enough milk. They didn't have, so literally they airlifted the cows in. And this is 2 Syrian Qatari brothers that set up this company called Baladna, and built it to be like a huge empire. And now they export dairy goods to the entire region. So, okay, this is one tiny example, and this does not constitute self-sufficiency, but from their perspective, it's a pretty concrete example of when we're forced into it, we can find ways to do it. I mean, yeah, Qatar is a tiny country. How the hell could they become one of the biggest producers of dairy products in the region? But they kind of have. And that's how they see what they're going to do in other areas. I think it's
So it's non-manufactured.
Yeah.
It's actually manufactured industrial machinery.
No, I agree. But it's not. Yeah, for sure. No, you're absolutely right on that.
Law.
Yeah, but also they're from their perspective, they're like maybe self-sufficient in like services, or which again, the way that we look at it, that's it's not sufficiency. But from their perspective, it's yes, it is. Like we have financial institutions and a banking system that's now fully self-sufficient. You're like, what the hell does that mean? But again, this is part of what I was saying. My third thing, perceiving it as a success, is like 90% of the way, because it just means that you're going to continue to insist on putting in place systems that you think will get you to, reach your self-sufficiency. I don't think it's possible for them, as you said, even human capital is too small, they won't be able to be fully self-sufficient, but I do think they're able to make progress in different ways. And for example, they also view diversification of their economies as a part of self-sufficiency. Don't ask me how, but for them, diversifying their economies away from oil is an effort to become more self-sufficient. That's literally how they do it. And in terms of diversification, they've had a measure of success. They're not as oil heavy in their economies as they were in the past.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it, especially as a student. So always try to piece together what's happening with it and it's laid out for us today. I'm sure like many of us have been following what's going on in Israel and Palestine very closely. So this question of mediation, competing for mediation that you brought up, I think is really interesting. And I was thinking about how the Emirates airlifted children last week. And how, reading about it on social media, how this was perceived by people. And now that through your talk, I started thinking about the Qataris and how they were involved in the negotiations with the hostages. So, are we, could you just sort of spell out some of these decisions a little more? Was the airlift sort of to counter what the Qataris are doing to show themselves as in more solidarity with Arabs in light of the normalization with Israel? If you could just
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, mediation competition amongst the Gulf Arab states is very real. It's very, very much here. I think they basically kind of the Qataris and the Emiratis first and the Saudis as well, they've kind of woken up to the prestige associated with mediation. So for them, it really became an important foreign policy objective. The more involved we are as mediators in international fora and conflicts, the better we look, the better it is for us. And there's a measure of truth to that. You know, this is how they make themselves indispensable to Western actors when they don't really have the military needs to be indispensable, where you know, money is no longer enough to make them indispensable. This works. Look at the way the U.S. was relying on the Qataris during the pullout from Afghanistan. Even today, the way that the Western world relied on them in the negotiations for the hostages. So they kind of cloaked onto the idea that this is good for them. And this is something that they're capable of doing. That kind of ignores some of their human capacity, because again, the Qataris got so into mediation that suddenly they realized they were stretched really thin, and basically their mediation person or their mediation team was essentially like one main person and like maybe two people helping him out, and suddenly he was stretched thin and he was doing like Afghanistan, Horn, Israel, Palestine, and just was not able to always in person. Yeah, so it's for them it's been one guy mediation But you'll be pleased to hear he's no longer the one guy doing mediation anymore. So they do have a capacity problem. But again, in their minds, this is something that we can fix. We have a small population, a very capable population, lots of money, and a full education. And so this is capacity that we can build. They really are investing in mediation capability. So that's kind of the context in which they're involving themselves in different crises as mediators, right? They really see that they really believe that this is something that they're good at, they can be successful at. This is kind of a new space where the old mediators like Switzerland or some of the other Western countries, like they're now countries that are biased, that are openly biased, they're not as neutral as they were before. Ukraine didn't really help because it made the West look pretty hypocritical, and Israel Palestine a million times more. And so suddenly they found themselves in this situation where, they were talking to the like bad guys, and they're also talking to the other side, and they have relationships with everyone, and so they can actually do this. And I think that, again, much like I talked about a new reality when it comes to the U.S.'s relationship with the Gulf Arab states, I think this is a new reality in the mediation space. It's something I was doing to Swiss officials last week, and I think the better part of like 2 hours was spent talking about how do we get back onto the mediation thing. And I'm like, sorry guys, that ship has sailed when you gave up neutrality during the conflict with Ukraine. And so in the age where non-Western powers feel like the West is very hypocritical, they've had enough of Western values, only being applicable to white people and not the rest of the world, these guys are really kind of in a good position to present themselves as mediators. Their mediation, though, is potentially problematic from the perspective of those of us who are outside the region, because naturally they're going to mediate in a way that suits them. They're going to establish relationships with people that suits them, and then, potentially you have an outcome that isn't the one that you want. You have greater, as you said, greater competition amongst themselves. That competition could potentially make it more difficult to be an effective mediator. If you have the Emiratis and the Qataris meeting in the Israel-Palestine space, then who's going to be successful? Is one country's involvement going to derail negotiations that's going on with another country? I mean, these are things that are perfectly possible. So I think we're in a bit of an uncomfortable space where we're having to get used to new countries being involved and being perceived as good mediators. And it's going to be something that Western powers again are going to have very little control over. And they're going to have to, the only thing they're going to be able to do is try to influence these countries as much as possible. I mean, sometimes that might work.
I think the next 3 questions and then Lindsay and Mercy.
Okay. So,
Where?
Oh, you have the question too? Okay, 4 questions.
I'll be quick. So so the narrative I have, capital becomes interested in foreign policy when it wants to expand. It's kind of like the story of Europe, right? We want to be interested in foreign policy when the domestic markets are saturated. Seems like the Emirates, the relationship between capital and decision making is probably going to be very complicated. That's the capital, foreign capital. And I'm just kind of the political science way of asking it is what are the special interests at play that are sort of dictating these foreign policy decisions, right? So it's not just they're asserting themselves. There's a lot going on. I know this is getting into the red line, but but I'm just wondering, obviously it's not
Like the drivers, right?
Yeah, I guess that's the neutral way to ask it. So who are the drivers, right?
The Emiratis.
The drivers are the migrant workers.
Oh yeah. Anyway, yeah.
So let me go to Eric because we can have a conversation later. Ask your question.
The only thing I wanted to ask about is, you talked a lot about the reception among leaders in the MENA region and then in Europe and US. Can you talk maybe a little bit about public opinion in the Middle East? Because, so my background is Turkish, and there's a real kind of resentment that's popped up in the last 5 years against all of the Qatari money that's poured into Istanbul, for instance. And I think the case of normalization with Israel is another thing where on social media, when that moment was happening, people were talking about how the Emiratis had kind of sold out the Palestinians and had been in support of Western kind of interests. So maybe just how ordinary people view this rise or changing foreign policy.
Let's do these two because we're running out of time and then we continue our conversation.
Or you just ask them, we can choose which one I answer this.
Ask them and
Okay, so I am going to ask. I think Michael Herb would say that the reason why all this is possible is because of the lack of democracy in the Emirates. You don't necessarily have to respond to that. I'm just putting that there. And how does that play out in Washington? And is the assertiveness of the Emiratis and them wanting to sort of do their own thing a way of strengthening their position against the U.S. who might use the D word too much? And democracy. and on top of that,
Also, thank you so much for the talk. You mentioned the complexity of domestic politics and the question is the rapid modernization, normalization, even the containment of Islam, which all seem to be top-down measures. Do you think there's a possibility of some sort of social backlash in general, in particular some sort of conservative backlash, like what it unfolded in Iran after Shah or in Saudi before, or it's no forces left and socially too?
Is that in all of the states or in the UAE?
5 years.
I just have to say, only in an academic environment will you say, I'm specifically not addressing this topic for a very specific reason, and then all the questions. Thanks, guys. We're really making this very difficult. Everybody makes, academia has to be. I'll try to group them all together. So the short answer is yes, I think the lack of democracy does make it easier for them. I don't think it makes it easier for them to be more assertive. I think it makes it easier for them to decide we're going to take this policy and take it and not have, you have nobody to report to, you have nobody to convince, you have nobody to basically sell this policy to, like you potentially would, if the US has to, although arguably not really, but if the US had to change foreign policy, then there would have to be a little bit of debate internally before we could do it. So I think lack of democracy there makes it easier for them to make the decision to pursue this stick with it, even if it fails. I mean, again, from their perspective, it's not failing, but even if it did, and they just thought, this is what we want because it makes us look good, then they could continue it. And that's where, not having checks and balances comes in handy. Is it to strengthen their position vis-a-vis the US? I don't think that's how they view it. I really think that Emiratis, but again, even the Qataris and Saudis, they really see it as we have to do this to secure ourselves because the US isn't here anymore. It's not we need to be stronger vis-a-vis the US, because I think there's a good hard dose of realism also that settles in. I mean, the size is not comparable, the capabilities are not comparable, we'll never be able to measure up to the US. So the argument is not, we need to be stronger vis-a-vis the US, it's just we need to be stronger and more capable to defend ourselves, more capable to secure ourselves if the US, the big guy who promised they would defend us, is not there to do it when the time comes. Is social backlash, sorry, I'm doing these in random order, is social backlash possible in the UAE? There was a little bit of it in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring. I don't know if you recall. It was in a very Emirati manner. It was like drafting letters and stuff like that, because obviously there is a public space for them to go out and demonstrate. But they were very good at cracking down. They were very good at wiping that out. And they're just generally very good at keeping a very tight lid on any kind of discontent. And it's easier for them to do that because you have this strong rentier bargain, you have this the ability for them to use their wealth to ensure that their population is well cared for, is well maintained. And so the idea is, well, look, you can live a good, healthy, happy life. Just don't ask questions. The minute you ask questions, that life becomes less happy. And I think up until now, aside from the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring,
it's true.
They're just going on a level. I just made, and also they have a population that's willing to accept it in a way that I think other populations may not necessarily be willing to do so. And again, the UAE, Qatar, again, the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, they were the two countries that really were able to keep a good lid on any kind of potential social discontent. The makeup, the kind of ethnic makeup, the religious makeup of their countries also made it that they didn't have as much discontent brewing, but whatever was brewing, they were able to kind of keep a lid on it much easier. Again, because they're the two richest countries in the region. It was much harder for Saudi Arabia, it was harder for Oman, it was harder for Bahrain, and as a result, this is when the GCC came together and really stepped in and with money tried to kind of assuage some of the problems that these countries had in order to kind of reestablish a measure of calm. So, in short, I don't think there's much scope for that. Certainly not in the UAE, even in Qatar. A little bit more arguably in Oman, Bahrain, not because it's not there, but just because, again, tight lid on it. Kuwait, measure of democracy, so, we've seen what's been going on with their government over the course of the last couple of years, so a little bit more movement there. Saudi is a big question. And that conservative backlash that you were talking about, we're seeing it unfold in Saudi Arabia. And this is something that Saudi officials are grappling with, are brutally aware of, and are trying to figure out how to navigate in order for things not to get out of hand. What else? Special interest, the drivers, domestic drivers. It's very much, I think, personality driven. It's the desire to build the UAE into what they want it to be built into is very much tied to Abizad's personality. And he was the one that really, in the 90s, started to talk about a more independent, reliable, self-sufficient, assertive UAE, and then kind of sort of pick up in pace after the Arab Spring. So it really is tied to him and how he views his country. That I think domestically that is one of the main drivers. And then again, this is where the lack of democracy comes in, because you don't really have a space for debate, because policy really is kind of set with one person and a couple of advisors feeding into him, you don't have that many other domestic drivers. Whatever he says is whatever's going to happen. So maybe that's a nice way for me to say, well, there wasn't much to look at domestically for me anyways. I wasn't going to look at the personality of one guy. And then public opinion and how people in the region view this. I think it's split, depending on who you ask in the region, I think it really is split between frustration for countries like Turkey, because that's where the money is flowing to, but pride for the countries that are doing it, because suddenly they see the rest of the world viewing them as, again, a force to be reckoned with, important countries, powerful countries, even though powerful that is debatable. So it really depends on who you're talking to. I think if you look at, for example, maybe public opinion in Egypt, particularly in the couple of years after the Arab Spring, when it started to see that Gulf money flow in and started to see all those conditions attached to the money, there was real frustration. The view was, well, we need this money, but damn, we don't want to give it to these conditions. We don't want to do what they're asking us to do. And so you had a lot of kind of frustration kind of building up. And you could almost draw a parallel with, the way the countries in the Middle East view the U.S. involvement in their policies. Well, as long as you have somebody externally involved in their policies, again, they come under scrutiny and they start to become the bad guy for everything that's going on. And I think increasingly you see the Gulf Arab states being viewed that way. Also because their involvement hasn't always been a positive one. And because it's been competitive, it's created problems in the different arenas that they've been involved in. So public opinion really is split, but public opinion within Gulf Arab states generally is quite supportive. Again, because it makes them look good, it inflates their importance on the international stage. It really gives them diplomatic prestige, mediation prestige, and so that's Emiratis, Qataris, Kuwaitis, they like that. They think finally this is our rightful place. So.
Thank you so much, Dina.